Truth or innocence can hang on a single piece of evidence. What you're about to see was one of the most complex homicide cases ever documented in Toronto. There was no eyewitness, no murder weapon, and only a mountain of circumstantial evidence that would have to be ferreted out, analyzed, and assembled. As to our Exhibit A, if I showed you, it would give it away. In an exclusive neighborhood on a quiet Remembrance Day, the lady of the house lies brutally murdered. The victim is Anna Lunt, 67. A German emigre who came to Canada just after World War II with her husband, Joseph. Shortly after their arrival, the couple was blessed with a daughter named Elsa. Elsa grew up and did postgraduate work in England, where she had met and married an engineer named William Appleton. In fact, it is William Appleton who helps police establish the time of the murder. He tells police he was in the habit of fixing things for his mother-in-law. Last week, he fixed her sink. This week, he'd promised to put up a plate rail. He said he'd come by at 5:30. He knocked a few times, and getting no answer, he headed off to the hardware store to get materials for the job. When he came back, the police were there, and his mother-in-law was dead. The body was so bloodied and battered that Appleton is dissuaded from viewing it. We pick up the story with the investigators.
Just one of the things we looked at is there must have been a lot of hatred here, because all the injuries sustained were basically all to the head, save and except for the hands when she was trying to protect herself.
As with all suspected homicides, the body is sent to the coroner's office to be autopsied. A pathologist determines Anna has been struck at least 65 times, mostly around the head and face. But a routine X-ray of Anna's skull reveals something startling. Bullet wounds. Exhibit A, bullets recovered from the body. These are what actually killed Anna Lunt. The reason the bullets hadn't been detected in the first place is that the killer had purposely beaten the victim around the bullet wounds. Why? To hide the fact that she'd been shot at all, because bullets can be traced. To understand how bullets can be traced, you need to know that commercial manufacturers cut spiral grooves into the inside of the barrel to stabilize the bullet, like a well-thrown football. The bullet, as it's fired, bites into these spiral grooves, leaving small striations known as rifling marks. These rifling marks, even from the same model of gun, are as unique as fingerprints. The reason a water tank is often used is that water doesn't affect rifling marks.
And there's 3. So what I'd normally do is I would take my suspect projectile and I would examine it. I'd go all around the circumference of it, looking for gross marks. Then I would put my test projectile that I recovered from a suspect firearm on the right-hand stage, match them up, First thing I'd look and I'd say, yes, the land and groove impressions are similar in size. They turn the same way and they're an equal amount. There's 5 on the suspect projectile, there's 5 on my test.
Sam examines the bullets that killed Anna Lunt and finds, well, see for yourself.
They were badly damaged, but when I examined them microscopically, there did not appear to be any rifling.
No striations, no rifling marks. Wait a minute, I thought that was impossible.
So if you had a smoothbore that had no rifling in it, or you had a homemade firearm that somebody had just drilled out and not put rifling in it, and consequently you would not have this individual rifling characteristics.
The people who make homemade guns don't go to the trouble of rifling the barrels. Therefore, no rifling marks and no way to identify the bullet. The murder had been extremely clever. So much for Exhibit A. With firearms stymied, the investigation shifted to other branches of forensic science. At most homicides, there is blood, an overwhelming amount of blood. Blood on the victim, blood from the victim, and blood on any discarded weapon. By studying the blood-stain pattern, a forensic biologist can determine the attack site, the likely position of the assailant and the victim, as well as where the victim was beaten, shot, dragged, and the force and number of blows. The task of deciphering this gruesome hieroglyphic falls to Jonathan Newman, an expert in blood splatterings.
It was quite clearly a very violent and sort of sustained assault on the victim. There was a lot of spattered blood. Normally when somebody cuts their finger, and that will leave a stain of a particular size, usually quite large. What we see typically in a beating or a shooting is that the stains are much smaller than one would see from just merely drip blood. And that is because there has been a force or an impact applied to the wound, which has caused the blood to be broken up into relatively small droplets. So the general principle is that the greater the amount of force applied, the smaller the droplets that are produced. So there were some marks which were described as being smears, characteristic of movement through wet blood. So we'll just take a tissue paper and we'll make a smear. This is where 2 items have come into contact, and then we have a movement of that item. Now the first smear in the middle is quite heavy, and that's quite difficult for me to determine the direction. But the top smear and the bottom smear exhibit certain characteristics which may allow me to determine a directionality. It's difficult for an unaware or an uneducated viewer to separate out what pattern is related to what action.
Anna Lunt had been attacked right inside the front door. She had been bludgeoned until she was a helpless heap on the floor. Then, realizing they were visible from the street, the killer dragged the battered woman into the kitchen, where she was shot with a homemade gun. But how had the killer gotten into the house? Was it a break-in? Was Anna surprised from behind as she came home from shopping? Was the killer someone already inside the house? Or had Anna Lunt opened the door to the killer? An investigation of the crime scene can take up to 2 weeks and may require dozens of rolls of film. The simple reason? Once the evidence unit leaves the scene of a crime, they can never go back and hope to find it exactly the same. So the photo ident unit shoots first and asks questions later.
You have little pieces of a puzzle, and you start gathering all these little pieces of that puzzle. And it's like anything. If you have a box and you open up and you get the puzzle, you throw it onto a table and you say, well, what have I got here? Well, you have to start looking at every piece to see what it means and put it together. And by the time you put it together, you're going to get a picture. And that picture will tell you a story. And that's exactly what happened here.
Each piece by itself may not mean much, but combine the hundreds of pieces and a picture emerges. Police brought Joseph Lunt in to question him about some photos. The front door showed no signs of a break-in. Mr. Lunt described his wife as a creature of habit. For instance, his wife was fanatical about answering the door for anyone she wasn't expecting, even close relatives. This pretty much ruled out the fact that she might have opened the door to the murderer. Anna was also a stickler about her rugs. She always took off her shoes as soon as she came into the house and put on her slippers. So the fact that she was found wearing her slippers pretty much ruled out that someone had followed her home and pushed their way in. There was also a new roll of paper towels on the counter. Because of her experience in the war, Anna Lunt was extremely frugal. She would have never opened up a new roll as long as the existing one wasn't totally used up. This suggests that the killer had unwrapped the roll of towels. Anna Lunt kept her paper towels under the sink. How would the killer know where to look? The week before, William Appleton had fixed his mother-in-law's sink. Appleton claimed that he got no answer at his mother-in-law's. He headed off to the hardware store to get materials for the job, and then went to the liquor store to buy a bottle of vodka. To verify his story, Appleton had even volunteered to bring the police the empty vodka bottle. At the time, Detective Matanovic said it wasn't necessary. But now he asked Appleton to drop the bottle off at his office. But before going to the police station, Appleton stopped at a discount store and bought a plastic container, the kind you stored food in. Next, he stopped at a liquor store and bought a bottle of vodka. Then he drove around, all the while emptying the vodka bottle into the container on his lap. Only then did he drop off the vodka bottle at Matanovic's office. Appleton had been under surveillance the whole time.
Friday the 13th came to haunt him. This was the bottle that he purchased back on November the 11th on Wednesday. He left the receipt in the bag, dated Friday the 13th.
It was time to examine Appleton's car, so it was brought to the forensic garage under the building.
In Appleton's car, we found a small amount of blood staining and some small tissue fragments in the area of the driver's door. In addition, in this case, there was some blood staining found in the trunk of the car. And that staining was in the area of the trunk opening right near the edge.
When they tested the blood, it belonged to Anna Lunt. When the police bring Appleton in again for questioning, again he changes his story. Now he tells police that when he came by to put up the shelves at 5:30, the door was open. He entered and called out, then he heard moaning. He tried to save her. His first thought was to call the police, but then he panicked. Afraid police might think he was somehow implicated in his mother-in-law's murder. So he left, stashed his blood-stained clothes in the trunk of the car, and bought a new pair of jeans. When he came back to the house, the police were already there. Appleton's story that he panicked is what's known as reasonable explanation. It would explain away all the evidence against Appleton, the vodka bottle, the blood in his car, and his running away from the scene. But was he telling the truth? And what about these? Was it conceivable that he hated his mother-in-law enough to beat her to a pulp and shoot her point blank in the face with a homemade gun? By this time, the police knew something about Appleton's personal history. He had been born into a London working-class family. At 12, his father died and Appleton was forced to go to work. He was lucky enough to get a job in a machine shop as an apprentice and become a skilled machinist. He met and married Elsa Lunt in London, and after the couple moved to Canada, he'd found work at an aerospace firm where he had risen to become a supervisor. Almost everyone at his work and his neighborhood spoke about him with respect. Again, investigators turned to forensic science, this time to Ron Smith, a forensic accountant.
The forensic accountant is just one more witness who assists the court in determining whether or not the accused is innocent or guilty.
Smith established that despite earning good money as a supervisor at the aerospace firm, Appleton's financial position had been deteriorating over time.
The shaded area being the amount of credit that he has used, and the black area, that little piece of the pie, is the unused credit.
At the time of the murder, he had exhausted his credit limit and was maxed out on all his credit cards. He had about a month's reserve before he would have to put the family house up for sale. So the police had a possible motive: money. The Lunts had considerable money, and Elsa was their only child. In the event anything happened to them, Elsa would inherit it all. As evidence began pointing more to Appleton, Detective Matanovic had a new worry. He was concerned that if Appleton felt the police closing in on him, he might panic and hurt his wife or son. At this point, the investigation shifted to England.
There was three reasons why they were important to the investigation. Number one, we didn't know enough about the accused, and we wanted to find out everything we could about him because it's very important. Secondly, the item that we were looking at, the homemade firearm, we had to prove that the accused was capable and had knowledge to manufacture such an item. And the third reason, probably the most important reason, is I've never been to England, so I wanted to go.
Working in tandem with Scotland Yard, Matanovic discovered two important facts. Appleton's first wife had died under mysterious circumstances. And as a lad, Appleton had apprenticed a machinist who had taught him how to build firearms. Meanwhile, detectives checked out Appleton's workstation. They found 3 hand-drawn diagrams.
I said they could well be rough drawings for a homemade firearm. I showed them a device similar. This particular one here, I'll show you. It's a cutaway, showing you the spring, and you can see how I can move it back. This I would refer to as the bolt. The part that is moving rearward when I pull this circular ring is the bolt. And it is just a solid, it does not have a firing pin as such. The hole works. The forward portion would act as a firing pin and would crush the rim, the entire rim of a cartridge case. Is threaded, and it threads into the rear portion of the body of the homemade firearm. Cartridge case is placed into the barrel portion here in the rear, and then it's threaded into the body of the firearm.
It certainly looks like a gun, but it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that.
I just let it go forward under spring tension, and it will discharge.
No rifling marks. Just like the bullets that had killed Anna Lunt.
I guess he probably looked at us as two dumb cops. That's probably what it boiled down to, and his arrogance was his downfall.
Appleton was arrested and charged with Anna Lunt's murder. Appleton's motive was money. He had intended to murder both in-laws and profit when his wife inherited. The plan had been foiled because Anna had told Joseph not to rush home for dinner. Appleton was going to put up shelves. As he lay in wait, Appleton had been spooked by a local newspaper delivery boy who thought it strange that the house was so quiet. Appleton was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison.
At the beginning, you build up the evidence, you gather the evidence, you effect an arrest, you present the case to a judge and jury. The jury listens, and at the end, after all that evidence is heard, they come back with a verdict of guilty based on reasonable doubt. You get that satisfaction because you have done your part to do something for the deceased who could not speak for him or herself. And it provides closure for the family.
At the trial, the judge commended the whole investigative team, saying that if the police and forensic scientists had missed the significance of a few early clues, Anna Lunt's murder would have remained unsolved and her killer would have gone free.
The stories on Exhibit A are based on actual cases. The names of the victims have been changed to protect their identities. The names of the guilty are real.